This is the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. My name is Angelica Solinska. I'm your host, and today I'm joined by the Dr. Sue Allingham, the lovely Dr. Sue. That's what we call her, the Dr. Sue. She's consultant, author, and trainer, and does lots of things in early childhood. I'm sure most of you know her. And today we are talking about learned helplessness. So thank you, Dr. Sue, for coming onto the podcast again. I know there's been a few episodes which you were on, I think, last year and recently with Australia Academy Trust as well on a project you're working with them. So why learned helplessness? Or I guess the first question should be, what is learned helplessness?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me back, and thank you for accepting my idea. It just basically, what is learned helplessness? I don't know whether learned helplessness is actually a scientific concept or a research-based concept. Mm-hmm. But a friend of mine teaches in a senior school, so it's that Key Stage 3, isn't it? Key Stage 3, Key Stage 4. Mm-hmm. And he teaches physics. And it's an all-girls school, and he's forever saying that he gets very tired because the girls can't do anything without him telling them what to do.
Okay.
So that made me reflect on, and then he came up with the term learned helplessness. And it made me think, because basically it reminded me of something that happened years ago to me. It was probably 30 odd years ago, because I'd only got 2 children at the time. And I was in a school, I was teaching in the nursery department of a big primary school. Mm-hmm. And I remember very clearly the year 5 or year 6 teacher, we were in the staff room or somewhere, and she said to me, I wish you wouldn't teach these children to be so independent, because we can't let them be like that when they come into the school.
Oh. Isn't that the opposite of what we want?
Well, quite. When he said to me that these girls in the sixth form or wherever, every time he set them something to do, they would be asking him, oh, what do we have to do? Where can we find that? How do we do such and such? He was really surprised, because you would expect, wouldn't you, girls in a senior school to be able to find a textbook, access something online, answer a question without having to be taken step by step through it by their teacher. Mm-hmm. So as I say, it reminded me of something that happened years and years and years ago, when a Key Stage 2 teacher said that she wished we wouldn't teach them to be so independent. And then I started to think, well, what are we doing then? Which made me have this whole big kind of brainstorm, which was when I contacted you, mm-hmm. about everything that is in our statutory frameworks, but then everything that actually happens on the ground. And how I can't go into any setting, whether it be a school or a nursery or a play group or anywhere, without thinking, are we teaching these children to be helpless? And I have a horrible feeling that sometimes we are. Our statutory framework requires us to get children ready for school and life. Now, I get lots of things are making me anxious today, obviously, but I get anxious about the getting ready for school part. Mm-hmm. But if we bracket that off and look at the idea of getting children ready for life, then surely we want them to have independence, don't we? Mm-hmm. Yes. And thinking skills. We don't want them to have to ask every time something happens, or be insecure about how to do something. So where's it going wrong? Where's it slipping? Mm. So were you going to say something then?
Well, I'm just kind of looking at learned helplessness more widely when you said it. You're kind of not sure where it comes from. And I know that it's definitely kind of based in psychology. And just having like a quick look at it in terms of definitions. In psychology, it's defined as a state that occurs after a person has experienced a stressful situation repeatedly, and then they believe that they're unable to control or change the situation, so they don't try. So it's basically that you don't have control over the situation or your life. So you don't try and change things. You think it is how it is, kind of thing. And like you said, with the teacher, with the girls, always almost like relying on the teacher, so they don't go out and find the information themselves, or they don't try because they feel like they're going to fail anyway. That's the kind of mindset, I believe.
That is really interesting, actually. Thank you for following that through with a little bit of depth, because that filters nicely into where I was going with this perspective that I've been thinking through. So I've mentioned statutory framework. A part of our statutory framework are the characteristics of effective teaching and learning, which obviously are a statutory requirement, despite the fact that possibly maybe they get forgotten about and ignored and overridden. But if you deconstruct the characteristics and look at how we must use them to inform our teaching so the children gain those learning experiences, we've got things like tenacity and resilience and critical thinking, motivation, being able to cope if things don't go wrong, questioning skills, explorative skills, all those things that are characteristics of effective learning, which we must embed in our teaching. So from a very early age, I mean, if a child's in a nursery, they could be having characteristics, hopefully underpinning the practice and provision around them from birth. So they might have had until they're 5 years old, hopefully in a setting that provides them with that. What goes wrong the minute they set foot into a school sometimes? Then we start to unpick, and your points then about fear of failure, fear of getting it wrong, we suddenly start to look at what happens when we go into schools, and we now have a day in a typical school absolutely crammed filled with preconceived curriculums.
Yes.
And you can't breathe unless it's done like this. You can't write unless it's done like that. You can't speak unless you're spoken to. I'm sure many of us will have come across the teach like a champion stuff, where I say, you say, I say, you say. Well, nobody in the whole world talks like that.
Yeah.
And the slant up, what is it? Sit up, listen. And what was it? Listen, I can't remember it all. Pay attention, notice, and something.
I don't know.
All that stuff where it's the adult telling you what to do. It's instead of being
very top down.
It's very top down, and instead of being a mixture of guide on the side and sage on the stage, which we would like to think we are as teachers, and I would argue not just in early years, it's about the sage on the stage, and that's it. And you're the only person in the room that has important things to say. Well, of course, in the early years, that's not the case. Well, it shouldn't be the case along the way anyway, but in the early years, it should be very much more of an interactive thing, a sustained shared thinking thing. If we're going to think about, why does my mind always go blank when we're doing a podcast? Iram Siraj and the sustained shared thinking stuff and the EPI project. We are effectively setting children up to fail, which is why we end up with sixth formers who can't do anything. So I guess what I'm looking for is, how do we stop this happening? How do we enable our children not to be suffering from learned helplessness, but to, what would be the opposite of learned helplessness?
Well, having self-efficacy, more of a growth mindset, that feeling of being able to affect change and develop their skills and capacity, that belief in themselves that they can reach goals.
That's the point. It's the belief in themselves. I can have a go at this. It doesn't matter if I get it wrong, but I can have a go and then see where we go from there. So in that case, you and I can speak about it as if it's really easy. How do we get teachers right across schools, and I don't just mean early years, to embody this in what they do? This is a typical out-of-the-box question, isn't it? How do we flip it on its head and make it right?
Well, I just, like you mentioned, it's really hard in schools, especially when there's certain targets, expectations, structures, tests, rigidity in learning, and all of this to meet that top-down approach. But we even do see it in early years as well, in terms of like the EYFS stages of development. If they're followed too rigidly, then children may be encouraged to do things that they're not yet developmentally ready to do. And that's where it all begins, I think. I know you mentioned going into school, but it can begin before school.
Oh, it can.
And even way before that, in terms of when children are at home with parents and families, I guess the pressure that parents may sometimes feel of, is my child potty trained yet? Can they write their name? And all these things, looking at other children and thinking they're ahead of my child. Should my child be doing this? And then that's when all of that comes in, of like the child feeling that whatever they do, they're not good enough, because, or you can't do this yet, or they're kind of pushed into that zone of I'm not ready yet. So if they're not ready, they're obviously going to not succeed.
What we want is some zonal proximal development stuff. You just said zone, isn't it? We want a bit of Vygotsky and a bit of scaffold challenge, a bit of all of those things are really interesting, because it feels to me then as if it's a societal slide towards learned helplessness. And what my friend is seeing is actually the young adults coming out the other end.
Yeah.
So what's it like in university then? Is it the same? I'm kind of asking not as a rhetorical question exactly, but I know how old you are. So I'm just wondering what it's like in universities these days.
Well, I was going to say, and I do work with, I mean, it's been long since I was at university, actually, although I am not quite 30 yet. But
you do work in one.
I do work with, university students. And to be honest, recently, and I guess we kind of place this on COVID. We always say, the COVID kind of cohort and things like this, have been seeing more students, even now, the first years and the third years as well, really struggling with looking for information themselves. And if they do come across setbacks, if they don't get the feedback or the grades that they expect or they want, then they do feel a little bit like, or that they express almost like they're giving up straight away. And instead of thinking, right, okay, what can I do to improve? How can I change this? Or I've got to really step it up. I've got to improve on what I did, or I've just not done good enough. So, right, this is it now. I need to focus. There isn't that kind of attitude as much as there was before. Even, well, I don't know. I don't know if I'm kind of talking from my experience as well, in terms of when I was at university and the students around me and myself, it was very much like, how do we succeed? Whereas now it seems a little bit more like, oh, well, that didn't work. Okay, then what next? And kind of like plod along. So yeah, that societal kind of shift. And then maybe there's more to it in terms of, I know this is a little bit controversial, in terms of being a lot more open to people struggling and potentially maybe having issues with mental health and things like that. And then I know there's been a lot of discussion even a few years back of, are people saying that they've got certain struggles, and is it almost like, in quotation marks, popular to have certain issues, or maybe even go to therapy and things like this. Unfortunately, with therapy and mental health being more accepted, we are seeing more people almost use it as an excuse rather than a reason. And I always talk to my students about that. I always say, yes, you may have got this setback, this difficulty, this challenge, these struggles, but don't use it as an excuse. Use it as your reason. I've got this, but I'm not going to let it push me down. I'm not going to let this adversity kind of stop me. I'm going to keep pushing through. I'm going to seek the help and support that I need. I'm going to still do the best I can with this situation rather than think, oh, this is it now. That learned helplessness that you're talking about.
It is, isn't it? And I think you've made, it feels like me interviewing you now. I feel as if there were such good points coming through that. I mean, you mentioned the pandemic. Now, that is hugely significant.
Mm-hmm.
And the students that you work with, that's going to have affected some of their key exam periods, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's going to have taken them out of school for key periods in their school development, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously the children that I work with, it's had a massive impact on their life altogether because they've not been on the planet very long, and a huge part of that was pandemic time. Mm-hmm. So, yes, I think that is a big factor. And the world is going to take a long time to get over that because it's changed the way we look at things fundamentally. It's even changed. I mean, I've been on a couple of buses today. It even changes the way people are on buses.
Yeah, well, how come? How so?
Sorry?
How so? What do you mean?
Well, I was on a bus last week as well. I use a lot of buses because it's easy where I live. Last week, a lady on the bus was sitting in front of another lady who started coughing, and it was only an ordinary cough, which people have. She got up and moved, the lady in front. Mm-hmm. And the other lady said, oh, it's only an ordinary cough. And they said, I don't want to get it. Whereas back in the olden days, I don't think we would have seen that, would we? Yeah. And today on the bus, people are very careful to be spread out. Mm-hmm. Even though we don't have social distancing anymore. It's all and people are very much about hand washing with hand gel now, aren't they, in a way that they weren't before, which is good. I haven't got a problem with that. But it's an impact on the very youngest children who haven't seen a different world, and they get hung up on stuff. The other point you made, which was really helpful and put things a bit more thinking in my head, was about the mental health stuff. And again, it's completely right and proper that we talk about mental health in a more open way, and it's not a stigma. Yeah. I will never forget many years ago now when I got a diagnosis of depression, which I'm not ashamed of. I didn't want to admit it to people. Yeah. And I thought, do you know what? This is really stupid. So the more often I said to somebody, oh, by the way, I'm, on these tablets because, and they said, oh, do you know what? So am I. And I suddenly found there were loads of people and I hadn't realised. Yeah. And whereas now we can talk about that better, can't we? Yeah. And it's not a stigma, and it's quite right that you say, actually, I've had a struggle and I'm getting through it. But again, that kind of, to me, conflicts with the learned helplessness until we look at it how you said it. People are using it as a crutch. And they assume if they meet a setback, maybe it seems too wrong a word, they can say, oh, something or the others rocked me or upset me, which it might have done. Yeah. But actually, I don't know what the answer is. But what is happening in schools flies in the face of all of that, doesn't it? It makes people feel guilty for having an emotional moment or needing some sort of emotional support. I don't know how much people listening to this or how much you follow social media conversations on Twitter about mental health. But people can be very scathing. Yeah. Very scathing. There's been a lot on Twitter over the last few days because a certain behaviour czar is in Australia pontificating his ideas. Hope he doesn't listen to this because I might get sued now. He's not likely to be one of your listeners, is he? And he is very much about strict. We have to be strict. There's no going to the toilet. There's no all this nonsense that you hear about children and how you can't have a disruptive can't have a disruptive child, you have to exclude them and blah blah blah. And then of course people are coming back and saying, well, have you thought this child might have an awful home life or adverse childhood experiences? Oh, well, we can't be too soft on these children.
And
well, go on.
I was going to say, with the kind of disruptive children especially, it's about giving them the skills, equipping them with the skills to deal with their emotions and behaviours. So there's almost like that learned helplessness encouraged there by that authoritative approach of, if you do something wrong, there's the consequence that the adult enforces upon you. Yeah. You have to go to this exclusion room, or you get told off, whatever it might be. You can't take part in certain activities. So that straight away is telling the child really that they don't have control over anything, and almost like, well, I was gonna say there's no consequence. There is a consequence, but it's almost like the easy option. Oh, I just go and sit in a room. For the adult. And almost for the child as well, in a way of that's encouraging that learned helplessness rather than thinking, okay, let's talk through what's wrong here. How are you feeling? Why are you struggling? Why was that not the right behavior? Let's work on this together and make sure that and then the child feels like there isn't that learned helplessness. They feel like that they have that growth mindset of, I can do something about this. I can change. I can control my behavior. This is a struggle for me, and I can accept that. I might be different from other children, but I can take steps to change or to control my behavior, to understand it. So
that's it, isn't it? It's about understanding. And I've just thought, there's two sorts of learned helplessness going on here now, aren't there? There's the sort where my friend was talking about his students who have to ask all the time, cannot just get on with something, have to check they're doing it right, have to ask where a certain thing is without finding it themselves. But then there's the sort that you're speaking about too, which is kind of, I'm helpless in this system and all I can do is kick off. But then actually you're, as you say, you talk about repercussions, but if you're that young person who is really uncomfortable in class for whatever reason, and then you get told you're going to be excluded and put in a, forget what they call it, zone, actually that's quite nice, isn't it?
Because you don't have to deal with all of the consequences of,
I mean, you might have to sit there and write or read or do some work in silence, but surely that, I don't know, because I've not been in that position, but I'm reflecting on my own school days where I was terrified of my maths lessons because I couldn't do them. And he was a very scary man, was Mr. Evans, very scary. And if you couldn't do it, you got into trouble. And my lovely best friend Hilary, who sat next to me, just let me copy hers. Now, of course, I hadn't got a clue what I was writing down, but she knew what she was doing. I mean, how I never got found out, I shall never know, because you would think, wouldn't he, that if he was marking my work and seeing I was getting it all correct, he'd pick on me in lessons and ask me questions. But I hated it. And I could have easily kicked off or burst into tears, but I was very passive. And I just accepted copying Hilary was the only way I was going to get through it. And that's a kind of learned helplessness too, isn't it?
I think so, yeah. I can really see that there.
Perhaps I should have thrown things and upended tables and that. And I mean, it won't surprise you to know that I'm hopeless at maths now. But then that brings me back to the early years and Key Stage 1 again. And the learned helplessness I see being taught to the youngest children through maths schemes. Now, I've been, and I've taught children myself, who are wonderful with numbers and love playing with puzzles and shapes and working things out. I've got an amazing photograph of a child in a reception class on a big whiteboard deconstructing a million He'd written 1 million across the board, and I'm a bit embarrassed to admit, but I will. He taught me how many zeros 1 million has. Up until about 6 years ago, I didn't know that. But he'd written 1 million, and then he was drawing lines down from it and writing component parts. And I was mind blown, because that's just, wow.
How old was this child? Did you say?
Reception. I'm not sure if he was 4 or whether he was 5, but it doesn't matter. So in this photograph, because he was on this big, big whiteboard, I then knelt on the floor next to him and started to deconstruct 22, because it's my favourite number and I could do that. So you've got a picture of his workings and my workings in the corner. But that blew my mind. And I had children in my own class who are now in their 30s. I still know one of their mums, who wanted to know from me how to add hundreds, tens and units. So I gave them a big piece of flipboard paper and we sat down on the carpet and we did hundreds, tens and units. Now, when I walk into classrooms now, fairly often they're using a maths scheme. I won't name any of them in case the people behind them are listening and I get sued for that. But people listening will know the kind of thing I'm talking about. So we go from one extreme to the other. We get children working with millions, hundreds, tens and units in reception. And then we get children who are working on a set workbook page, learning about the oneness of 1, the two-ness of 2, the three-ness of 3 or whatever, which I'm not against, because obviously that's important and I used to teach that stuff myself. But when I hear people say that they can't go past the number 10 until all of the children in their cohort understand 10, what happens to the children who can already deconstruct millions, hundreds, tens? They're sitting there twiddling their thumbs because there are, and there always will be, and I'm one of these children who's numerically challenged. There will always be children who need more work on that. Of course there will. But isn't that what being a good teacher's all about? But if all of a sudden you're presented with a scheme that your school has bought into and you have to work it on these weeks as the weeks go through, and no child can move forward until everyone's got that bit, doesn't that produce learned helplessness?
In terms of the children who are actually exceeding those expectations, and they could potentially be disruptive in the classroom because they're bored, because they're already so.
Oh, they just become compliant. We're training the children to only be what the teacher says. So
you're setting a limit, basically, on
absolutely
what they can learn at what stage of their development. So it's almost like on one side of the spectrum, we are often pushing children to learn things, work on things which they're not yet developmentally ready for because of a lot of these structures in place, expectations, societal expectations, tests. But then at the same time, with specific schemes, we are making sure that everybody's learning at the same pace. So then we're limiting children on the other kind of end of the spectrum who are exceeding expectations, but we still can't be flexible enough.
I'm going to pull you up on the use of the word expectations, I think, because one of my biggest bugbears, and you know me, I get very hung up on words and the use of language. Yeah. I get very hung up on the expression age-related expectations. Because what on earth does that mean? That's why I do a lot of work around it being stage of development, not age, because chronological age means nothing. I mean, obviously it does to a certain extent, but just because you're 5 doesn't mean that you can or you must not. And so we've got the children who might be limited by a specific bought-in scheme, but you just also hit the nail on the head with another type of bought-in scheme, the phonics schemes, which tend to rush off in the other direction.
Yeah.
So we've got learned helplessness the other way round almost. You've got children, and I've met them in so many scenarios. Children who just haven't got a clue what blending is. And you see it every day because it's that time of year where we're heading towards foundation stage profile and early learning goals being judged. So many people now filling up social media with, my children can't blend yet, my children can't do all their sounds. And you think, no, because I expect some of them are still only 4.
Mm-hmm.
And give them a chance, they're babies.
Mm-hmm.
And I know it's a hackneyed expression, but some children in other countries don't start to read until they're 7. But then other children come into school reading.
Hiya! Just quickly, I wanted to ask a favour from all of the listeners and viewers. It would really help this podcast if you subscribe on the platform you are listening or watching on. This will help the Voice of Early Childhood podcast to continue putting out thought-provoking and reflective episodes with a range of guests. And if you are enjoying listening to this podcast, please do share it with someone else who you think would love it too. And of course, as always, we encourage you to share your voice too. If you have reflections, thoughts, and comments, please do share this episode on social media with your comments and tag the Voice of Early Childhood. Let's keep these thought-provoking discussions going. Thank you. I'll let you get back to the episode now. It's kind of like those life skills that we need to really be focusing on developing in children so that they don't develop that learned helplessness so early on when they feel like they're really being pushed too far too soon. So they don't have that growth mindset and self-efficacy of I can achieve, I can try harder, I can set and reach my own goals and targets, and I can get excited about maybe externally set goals, whatever they might be, or even expectations. So that's a really important thing of before we focus on those mathematical skills and more academic skills, I guess is what I'm saying. Before we focus on those academic skills, we need those life skills. So then children are ready to progress with the academic skills, and hence why countries that are the school starting ages a lot later, they're not behind because they start those, focusing on those academic skills later because they've learnt all of those skills of, I can do this, or I am curious, or
that's the point, isn't it? It's I am curious and I want to have a go at this,
and I want to learn
because I know I can try.
Yeah, and they don't feel like they don't want to try anymore because they've not had all these setbacks of failing, and they've not developed that learned helplessness then. And even those children who are exceeding your expectations as a teacher, perhaps, then they...
That word expectations again.
Yeah, well, maybe developmental, maybe age, scheme expectations, whatever they are. If they are, really progressing fast and you're limiting them, then they kind of feel like, well, I can't achieve because I'm kind of constantly being stopped.
There must be a what's the point in carrying on with this to somebody, mustn't there?
Yeah.
And I've got so many examples flying through my head of ways I've seen this happen over the years. Going back again to my own career, I had this wonderful little boy. Again, I know his mum still, so he must be in his 30s as well, I should think. He was really good at maths. Seems to be a lot of my stories about boys and maths, but this is another one. And he was flying. There wasn't anything he couldn't do with numbers. And I remember when he went into year 1, and you know that classic thing that we do in schools whereby you send children to their previous teacher to show how brilliant they've been, so they get a star, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a long time ago. I didn't actually give stars out. I gave up doing that years and years and years ago. But anyway, Andrew came back to me one day from his year 1 class, and he had a page of adding up sums in his book that he'd done. And he said, Mrs. Such and Such says, I've got to come to you and show you how wonderful this is, or words to that effect. And I said, that's great, Andrew, well done, thinking all the way through, but you were doing more than this when you were in my class. Which, of course, I couldn't say to him because he'd have been soul destroyed.
Yeah.
But I wanted Andrew to go back and say to his teacher, Mrs. Allingham said, when you were in my class, you were doing much more than that, Andrew.
And yeah, like you say, that would that'd be really disheartening for the child. But actually, there is
disheartening for me.
well, yeah, of course, but there is that balance to strike of. It's almost like, is it a bit of tough love, I guess, in a way? I don't know. But in terms of thinking you can do more than that. And actually, funnily enough, me and my partner have this discussion all the time of, well, we had it a year ago of this links to unconditional love of, should you accept and love a person for who they are and don't want them to change? That's true unconditional love. Mm-hmm. And if you want them to change and if you want them to improve and progress, is that saying that you don't love them for how they are? But actually, you think they can do so much more and be so much more, and they have capacity to do so much more. They have potential, and you want them to be the best version of themselves because you can see that in them, and you want them to I guess be happier and all these things progress. So that's love, isn't it? Wanting
I absolutely agree.
Better.
I mean, a phrase I use a lot in my own work is we want children to be the best they possibly can be, don't we?
So that's what my what I thought with your example, that's what came to mind in terms of getting that balance right of this is great, but
and see how far we can take it.
Yeah.
I mean, that goes back again, doesn't it, to the zone of proximal development and the Vygotsky stuff. It's about, wow, look at that. I wonder what else we can do. Mm-hmm. Push.
Yeah, but it's just so important to celebrate what the child can do and has achieved in that moment, because I think I can really see that with adults, to be honest, in terms of really seeing how they've been affected in their childhood when everyone was always, parents especially, are always like, so say if, this happened to me when I was a child in terms of if I got a good grade, if I got a B or an A in GCSEs or A levels, then it's like, oh, but why not an A? Why not an A star? What's happened there? What's the rest of the, do you know what I mean? What did you get wrong and why, and how can we improve that, instead of really celebrating, be like, oh, this is fantastic. So I think a lot of traumas can come out of that, of like, celebrating your achievements.
Yeah. I've already burdened you with my maths trauma. I won't bore you with the rest of them. But all of this, I think, is building in this learned helplessness where the child will get to the point where they think, do you know what, I'm just not going to bother anymore. Mm. So I wonder, and thinking about the fact that I've said this from my own past, which is quite a long time ago, how I've got to the point now where I will try things. There are certain things I won't try, like swimming, which I was talking about on Sunday. I won't try that anymore. But anyway, so we get these young children, and it is our mission on the statutory framework and as good teachers to get them to be the best they possibly can. I've got another slide I use with some children in a setting near where I live, looking out the window at the clouds across the Thames. Mm-hmm. And it's like they're looking up to the sky. It's Buzz Lightyear, isn't it, to infinity and beyond?
Yeah.
It's a bit like the sky's the limit.
Yeah.
We shouldn't cap this off.
Mm-hmm.
And I use capped learning a lot. So what are we doing in our work as teachers or practitioners or whatever we call ourselves that gives those children the glimmer of, I can do this, I will have a go, which, as I said, are the characteristics of effective teaching and learning. Mm-hmm. How can we build in to these schemes, these bought-in curriculums, all this other, am I allowed to say nonsense?
Well, that's your view, isn't it?
Well, it is my view, thank you. All this stuff which we are heavily lent on to buy into, even though there is no statutory requirement for any of it, on the premises that Ofsted says we have to have this, or Ofsted says we have to do whatever. Are we enabled to, as adults, not become those learned helpless people who just do as we're told? How can we be enabled as teachers to throw in the enabling bit? Because with the best will in the world, one of our 4 overarching statutory principles is enabling environments.
Yeah, certainly. That's a really good point, actually.
If we close it down, what happened to the unique child and the enabling environment? What happened to the positive relationships? Relationships are two-way things. And I've got a note on my whiteboard. I often write notes on my whiteboards of sound bites that you've said.
Oh, really?
I've got we don't teach curriculum, we teach children, which I think is one of yours.
Is it? Oh, I don't know. Well,
it came up in one of our podcasts, I think. But another one I've got here, I do not like progress and development as an expression. I very much prefer development and progress.
So
when you
instead of progress and development, just around development and progress, right?
And in our statutory framework, it's often written as progress and development, but I've changed it round.
So how come?
Because in my head, which is a very weird place, in my head, unless you have informed development, you're not going to make informed progress.
Right.
But if you're focusing on the progress bit first, okay, somebody would argue back, but if you don't progress, you can't develop. But in my head, again, a very odd place to be, the statutory framework stuff and the national curriculum type stuff sees progress as very much a stage thing.
Yeah.
Rather than what Bertha Five Matters calls dancing around a ballroom rather than climbing a ladder. So I think as I say, I very much prefer development and progress because development to me is very fluid. And then you can make progress.
Yeah, when you know where your starting point is. So it's starting from the child, isn't it? Like we often say.
Well, like the new Julie Fisher rewrite of the book. Exactly that. Where's the child gone? And that, I think, is central to all of this, isn't it? Where's the voice of the child gone?
So I think in all of this that we've discussed so far, it's really about having flexibility. So educators having flexibility within the frameworks that they work in, the curricula that they either set or follow, the schemes that they follow, because there are set framework schemes, curricula at whatever point, in most settings, there are things that need to be followed, statutory or non-statutory. So it's about being flexible enough as an educator to ensure that you are supporting every single child, from those that you need to make sure that you're not pushing too far and that they are in their developmentally appropriate zones.
I don't mind a bit of push.
But also not too far. So then
push.
When you're aware of their stage of development. So then you don't encourage that learned helplessness.
Exactly.
But then on the same on the other side as well, not limiting them too far and really opening up to what we were talking about, sky's the limit, and enabling them to keep learning, keep being curious and keep progressing, and not limiting them with schemes, and having that flexibility to work outside of this scheme and framework.
So how do we do that then? Because in a way, we've got adults with learned helplessness now doing this.
Yeah, I was thinking that too, in terms of educators themselves.
Yeah.
Feeling like they've got this curricula to follow, they've got this scheme to follow. They don't have enough of their own ownership of this. They don't have flexibility over this. They can't exert their own professionalism and expertise. So they kind of think, well, I've just got to go with this because I've tried to talk with senior leadership teams. I've tried to really push for the EYFS kind of stage of the school, for instance, and I'm not being listened to, because we often hear that the early years, the foundation stage, is always forgotten about in schools and not listened to enough, because there's only one teacher there representing that stage.
Yep.
So yeah, there is that learned helplessness from the educators as well. I can really really see that.
It's a really interesting one, that, because it's in sort of fits and starts all the way up the school in varying degrees, but I think it's the early years that gets it most from the adult point of view.
Mm-hmm.
This is going to sound wrong, but I don't know how else to put it. It's almost easier to be learned helpless as a teacher and to rely on a preconceived curriculum or scheme of work. I'm going to get a lot of flack for that, I should think, because it probably isn't easier paperwork-wise or assessment-wise, and it's probably not easier to deliver to a group of children who are all going to be at a different stage, but you've got to deliver that one package. But from a point of view of back in the day when we used to have to think up our own lessons 100 years ago, it's more of a crutch, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I can remember sitting in whole school assemblies thinking, what am I going to teach when I get back to my classroom? But always something came out of the hat.
Well, it's just there is a lot more work involved in terms of there's that uncertainty. You're not following something that's already set out for you. There's constant changes and tweaking. And I guess people say this in terms of set curricula anyway. You do have to adapt to your children, especially different cohorts.
But do you? Are you allowed to?
You're doing it on your own. Oh, I don't know. Yeah, I guess maybe in some curricular frameworks.
I don't think you are. I mean, certainly from the experience I've had of certain phonics programs, it doesn't matter which children you've got sat in front of you.
Yeah, I guess those schemes of work programs, they're a little bit different to a curricula that you're following with overarching themes that you may have brought into.
Yeah, overarching themes, they have their plus side. Mm-hmm. But then that adapts with the children each year, as you say, especially in early years. And if it's not going to work talking about spring because they're not interested, then you go with something else.
Exactly.
Oh, this is really complicated. But there must be a way through this, because what we don't want is what my friend is coming up against, those sixth formers who can't think for themselves. Mm-hmm. It's the classic one that I read sometimes on, again, these behaviour conversations that go on social media, mostly aimed at senior school, but children who can't organise themselves with the right bits in their pencil cases or something. And I fully accept that there are children, for whatever reasons, it's difficult at home and a complete pencil case is difficult. But the child who gets up in the morning and just can't sort it unless mum or dad does it for them, and then can't do something at school unless the teacher tells them directly what to do, I don't know.
Well, I was going to say there's, throughout this episode, that there's been a lot that we kind of opened up conversations on this and helplessness, problematizing a lot of things, opening up that debate. So in terms of the listeners' and viewers' perspective, we'd love to hear more from people. So more views, examples.
I'd love that. Because problematizing things can be very useful, can't it?
And that means we don't necessarily have the answers. We don't have all the answers. And even in this episode, we probably don't have any answers at all. We've just...
No, I do know that I don't want teachers saying to early years teachers, I wish you wouldn't teach them to be so independent, because we have to stop them being that when they're in year 5. I don't want that to happen anymore.
Yeah. That's certainly a problem. But... yeah, so there might be people out there listening to this who have got experiences to share, different views, maybe expertise on this in terms of particularly the theory of learned helplessness itself, how that comes about, and everything that we were kind of discussing at the beginning. And I think what you said, Dr. Sue, actually around how do we change things in terms of educators' mindset, I guess, and educators' own kind of almost like learned helplessness of we've got to work with these schemes and actually we don't have enough ownership of our teaching anymore. I think the work of Dr. Jo Albin Clarke and Dr. Nathan Archer on advocacy, agency, and rights in terms of children's rights and educators' rights as well. I think that really comes into this context of speaking out and keeping going with that. You know, they talk about advocacy in terms of, I guess, publicly supporting an idea or a concept, or, you know, publicly speaking out about something that is important. And we need to share more of our, I guess, we need to problematize more, and share more of our, like, I guess, unhappiness about things, and, you know, things that we don't actually agree with, and advocate for early years in that way, and for ourselves as educators, teachers, our rights in terms of we want to create our own curricula. We want to have more of a influence on this. So that's important to keep speaking up. And it's hard when you already feel that, you know, learned helplessness, so you feel like you can't speak up. So it's a bit of a trap.
It's a vicious circle, certainly.
Yeah.
But I think you've got to the nub of the conversation by saying about problematising it and realising, actually, and it is that whole thing that Nathan was speaking about on your day, isn't it? It's that whole advocacy thing.
Yeah.
And also, of course, it's the name of your site here, The Voice of Early Childhood, as well. It's not just about me or you or the other adults in the room. It's about everybody having a voice.
Yeah.
And in many ways, definitely we must give those early years children a voice in their independence. And sorry, Year 5 and Year 6 teachers, if the children then arrive with you and they go and select a pencil, or they go off and get some paper and you haven't said they can, then that's to be celebrated, isn't it?
Because they are being independent and owners of their own learning. And I guess there's so many links to this. I'm thinking they're active citizens in society, links to sustainable development goals, you know, the social sustainability aspect. We're teaching them.
You're not going to make me talk about sustainability again, are you?
That's another topic in itself. But yeah, that's what we want children to be able to do. We want them to be able to I guess, talk, again in quotation marks, talk back. That's kind of the way we see things with children. Don't agree with, you know, with something that the teacher says, or they don't want to do something. There is that element, they're talking back, don't talk back at me, don't you know, don't disagree with
I think we need to move slightly around with the hierarchy thing going on here, because children do know sometimes more than we do. I was recounting a last couple of weeks. I was only in my second or third year of teaching, so it's quite a long time ago. And I was tasked with doing some teaching with a small group of children on the solar system. Now, remember, this is a long time ago and we didn't have the internet. So I'd done a bit of research, and there was a little boy in the group, and I will never forget his name. It was Simon. I can't remember his surname, otherwise I'd Google him. But he's going to be in his 40s, because my eldest son is nearly that, and I left that school to have him. So this guy called Simon, who'll be in his 40s now, I will never forget him sitting in front of me, and he would have been 6 at the time, because it was a Year 2 class. No, he'd been 7. And he sat there and he said, "But Mrs. Allingham, you're wrong." Now, I'd only been teaching 2 or 3 years. And at that point, it's like, what? Teachers can't be wrong. But of course, I went away and looked in my big tomes of encyclopedias that I could find in the school library, and he was right and I was wrong. And I had to obviously admit to that fault. Why can't we still do that?
And it's about encouraging children that it's okay to be wrong. And I
mean, there are possibly ways of putting it to the adult that they're wrong. But children do know more than we do. And if children are asking interrogating questions and open-ended, you know, want to find out something. Only recently I've been having conversations with teachers who are being told that, oh, no, you can't teach them that in reception year because they do that in Year 2. And I had that, again, hundreds of years ago. The children in my reception class wanted to learn about plants. It came from them, because learning about plants is really exciting. And we were doing seeds, and we were looking at things growing in glass jars and all the roots coming down and everything. And they were fascinated. So I went to the school library and pulled out all the books on plants and growing. And a year 2 teacher came in and said, oh, you can't have those books in reception. They're the year 2 books. I know. So I said, oh, well, I will be using them because my children want to learn about how plants grow, and I want these books in my environment for them to look at. Mm-hmm. Granted, they might not understand all the detail or read all the words, but that's not the point, is it?
No, not at all. Yeah, it's about allowing...
But I've had a lot of conversations recently about teachers being told they can't teach particular things in reception classes because actually, no, that's in year 2 or year 4 or year 6.
See, that's so rigid, isn't it?
That's learned helplessness again, though, because a child will only be told that every so often before they think, do you know what, there's no point in asking.
And I'm not going to be curious anymore. I'm not going to bother. Yeah, I'm not going to ask. I'm not, yeah, that's really sad, actually. It reminds me of learning behaviors, what Jan Dubiel talks about in terms of it's not about the dinosaurs, as he says. It's not about what they are learning, not that topic. It's not about the fact that we want them to know facts about the dinosaurs. It's the fact that we want them to develop that sense of lifelong learning and curiosity and critical thinking.
It's fascinations, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm just nearly at the end of doing a big project for the Welsh Government, and the Welsh documents talk about the children's fascinations, and I think that's lovely. Because if we keep the children having fascinations, then surely they're not going to become helpless, are they?
Yeah, because they can still remain curious. They are encouraged to find out, progress. We're fostering that lifelong learning, aren't we?
Yeah, which right the way goes back to where we came in on this, the statutory framework, which says we want children to have skills for school and for life, or words to that effect, certainly for school and for life. And you think, I don't like the tension there. Because of the skills for school, are they necessarily going to be what we want them to be for life?
And isn't skills for life bigger than skills for school anyway? So that is enough.
Well, quite. But this is a government document we're talking about.
Well, maybe...
I put my cynic's hat on again. But that rolls back to progress and development, or development and progress, doesn't it? And we talk a lot about, or it is talked a lot about in the early years, because it comes from Lillian Katz and the NAEYC, which I can never remember what it stands for, the American website and organisation. Anyway, NAEYC, and they talk a lot about developmentally appropriate curricula, developmentally appropriate practice. Whereas I prefer, and I've changed it in my own stuff, to developmentally informed practice. Because what I might deem appropriate might not be what you deem appropriate for all sorts of reasons, subjective reasons. But if we are both informed about what's practice, then we've got to get away from judgmental on either of our sides. Because if we're informed about the child, it's going to be perfectly appropriate. So I've changed DAP into DIP. But as I say, we can get tied up in semantics. But learned helplessness is a couple of words I do not like. And I see it too often. So basically it throws the question wide open. What can we do to get over it, doesn't it?
Yeah, especially the fact that it's not just the children, it's adults and educators themselves, like we said. So there's a lot of things.
It's something to reflect on. It's another one of my classic expressions. It's one to step back, take a 5 minutes deep breath, and then think about it.
Well, yeah, certainly a lot to discuss, debate, reflect on, look into more. The reflection element, I think, is key in terms of... We did a lot of reflection today, I think, on this episode.
I think so. I've enjoyed talking about it, actually.
And yeah, really, really opening up more questions and giving answers. And like I said earlier, with everyone who's listening and viewing this, it will be great to hear your views. So please do share this episode on social media with your views and comments and tag us in so we can engage in the debate and we can see what people are thinking and hear the different views. And within our reflections as well, there's a lot of links to other people I've spoken to already on the Voice of Early Childhood. Actually, I'll mention a few of the names here before we wrap up the episode. So Matt Baller's episode, an article on growth mindset. Mm-hmm. We mentioned growth mindset a few times. That really links into what we were saying, as well as Maureen Hunt's episode, an article on self-efficacy. Then we've got recently Zanna, Clarke and Carmela Garcia spoke about life skills over academic achievement. Again, things that's
massively significant.
Yeah. And of course, Dr. Geraldine Clarke and Dr. Nathan Archer, they speak about advocacy, agency and rights in early childhood education and care. Again, Carmela Garcia Manas's work on social sustainability and her research on this. Like I was saying, in terms of children being active citizens in society. So we really need to be encouraging that. And then, of course, as well, at the end, that we mentioned Jan de Beel's work on it's not really about dinosaurs. So when he talks about the learning behaviors, as he calls them. Yeah. So there's some really interesting episodes and reads to kind of expand on the conversations we were having. And I feel like everything really, really links nicely together.
It does, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And as you say, there is such a lot of work out there about it.
Yeah. And
even if we've twigged something in somebody's head with this conversation to think, oh, learned helplessness, I'm going to look out for that now.
Yeah. And I'm sure there's so much work on there anyway, out there on learned helplessness. I know it's more kind of psychology based, but there must be things obviously relating to children, and that this is where it all begins.
Just thinking, I bet now if anybody listens to this, the next time they go into a group of children, they'll go, oh, yes.
They really kind of see this in practice. So yeah, it would be really interesting to hear from viewers and listeners in terms of your experiences linking this to practice, and the links to all of these other episodes and articles that are related. I'll include in the episode description. So that's all there to have another look at and read. And big thank you to Dr. Sue for coming on again and having this joint reflection, reflection.
It was good to talk, actually. Thank you for that.
Yeah, it's great to really have this space for that shared reflection rather than necessarily have all the answers. I think it's important to model the fact that it's important to dwell on things, to, like we said, problematize, to reflect, shared reflection, co-reflection is really vital.
Yes, it is important. I'm not going to witter on about reflective, reflexive and reflection. That's another talk for another day.
Yeah, we could unpick all of those, actually. There's a lot to unpick. But anyway.
I've done some training about that. Yes, that's another day.
I'll have to have you on again on another episode.
Brilliant. Thanks, Angelica.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm sure we'll hear from you again soon.
I expect so. I'll find you somewhere soon as well, I expect.
Speak soon.
Bye.